I've got about $600 worth of brushless motors here, and they're all broken, including this one, which is brand new. Let's fix them. Before we get started though, let's talk about some motor basics. There are two main types of motors you're gonna see in this hobby: brushed motors and brushless motors. Brushed motors used to be super common, but brushless motors are the most common motors you're gonna see these days. These two motors differ in one main way. A brush motor will have two wires to it and has a physical connection inside that determines when power is sent to the windings that turns the motor. A brushless motor has three wires going to it, has a different winding setup inside, and has electronic control of when the electricity is sent to those different windings to spin the rotor. Brushless motors are significantly more efficient than brushed motors, simply because they don't have a changing electrical connection inside, and they are typically more powerful for a given size because of that increased efficiency and because they're made better with better magnets and more modern technology. The only real advantage of a brushed motor is that it's cheaper. Now, whether it's a brushed motor or a brushless motor, there are very few moving parts inside these things, so when they break, you can usually fix them. Let me show you what's wrong with these. First of all, this is a 1717 Castle motor, and the sensor board on it has gone bad. It doesn't work properly when censored. This is an older Castle motor that was in a Traxxas X01. It has bad bearings. Listen. You hear that little howl sound? Those bearings are junk. This is a Castle 1515. It has a stuck pinion, and this poor little guy has a bolt broken off in the end bell. Now, these are all very common problems with these motors. Fortunately, we can fix most, if not all of them. Before we do that, let me show you how to fix any common problem with a brushed motor. Seriously though, most brushed motors aren't really designed to be repaired. They're crimped together, and they're not really worth repairing because cheap brushless systems are not that expensive these days, and it's really just not worth messing with these anymore. There are some exceptions, of course. If you have a vintage brush motor that has external brushes, you can replace those brushes, and they may even have replaceable bearings, etc. But in general, just toss these and upgrade to something brushless. The first problem I want to address is probably the most common, and that's going to be bad bearings. There are several symptoms of bad bearings. You may hear a whining or grumbling sound in the motor itself, such as this. That is a sure sign that you've got bad bearings. You can also check for bad bearings in the front, at least, by holding the motor, grabbing the shaft, and wiggling back and forth. I don't feel any play in this front bearing, but if you did feel play, that would be a sure sign that these bearings are bad. These bearings go bad so fast because they're under a lot of stress, a lot of high speed, and sometimes they get wet, and even a sealed bearing is not completely sealed. Water is going to get inside that, mix with the lubricant, and destroy it. Fortunately, for most motors, you can get bearing replacement kits pretty inexpensively. This was $15, and it has a ceramic front bearing that's sealed and should be a great kit to replace it. Now, you can get generic sized bearings to replace the bearings in these motors, but I don't recommend it because these motors spin very, very quickly, up to 60, maybe even 70 or 80,000 RPM, and standard bearings really aren't designed to handle that kind of speed. Getting these bearings out can range from being very easy to very challenging, but the first step is to take the motor apart. Most brushless motors are going to come apart in a similar manner. The front and rear end bells, which are these front and rear plates, will come off, usually with 3 screws or 4 screws either in the front or in the side. Taking these screws out is going to give you your first look at the condition of the motor. Typically, if the motor's been underwater, you're probably going to see some rust on these screws. You can see some rust on this, so this motor has been wet before. Once you get those screws off, hopefully you can just pull the end bell off really easily like that. Sometimes you won't be able to though. You might need to do a little bit of prying around the edge. Just be careful that you don't damage anything. Now we can see inside here that this thing has definitely had a hard life. Fortunately, there really aren't any moving parts besides the bearings in these motors, so as long as it's not burned up and you replace the bearings, you basically have a brand new motor again. Once you take this end bell off, be careful because there's almost always going to be some sort of spacer and often a spring underneath that spacer. In this case, we don't have one. And you can pull the rotor out. This rotor is held in very tightly with magnets, so it's going to be hard to remove. Just be careful with it. So we pull that rotor out, and then as you can see, another spacer fell out the back. Make sure you keep track of where these spacers are supposed to go. Take a picture of them, because if you put them in wrong, it's not going to run right. Once we get the rotor out, and this is going to be the same for basically any brushless motor you look at, you want to inspect the rotor. Sometimes it'll look like this. The magnets are wrapped in Kevlar and then epoxied. If that Kevlar is significantly damaged, this rotor is junk because it is going to fail and those magnets will fly apart. Castle and Hobbywing both sell replacement rotors for some of their motors, but unfortunately not that many of them. You also want to inspect the shaft, make sure that there's no significant damage to it where the bearings go. If you had a bearing completely seize, there's a chance that the shaft will get destroyed where the bearing goes, as the shaft itself spins in the bearing instead of the bearing spinning within itself. If all that looks good, you can give this a quick cleanup and move on to the next step. This putty here is not dirt. It was put in here from the factory to balance the rotor. Make sure you don't remove that when you clean it. There might be some in both sides. And I will just remove the rear end bell. As you can see, a couple of the screws have been replaced on this. That's not a big deal. Happens all the time. And we want to make sure we keep inspecting as we go. There's no point in spending a bunch of money on bearings for a motor that is significantly damaged. So far, this one looks good. There is some damage on the outside of the motor, but that shouldn't affect anything internally. We can see there is some damage right here. See how this hole has been ripped out? That might be a problem, but since the other two holes are okay, we're just going to ignore it and hope it isn't a problem in the future. And here we can see the windings. Of course, everything is dirty. I'll just blow that out with compressed air. It not being perfectly clean doesn't really hurt anything, as long as there aren't any massive chunks of debris in there that are going to jam on the rotor. The front bearing is going to be really easy to remove because you can just tap it out from this side. The rear bearing is going to be more challenging because there's no access to it from the back side, but I'll show you a couple of tricks to try and get that removed. I've just got a hammer and a socket here. You'll need something that's larger than the bearing, so the bearing has something to fall into. Just got a little punch here, and I'm just going to knock that bearing out. Now, like I said, the rear bearing's a lot more tricky because there's no access to it from the opposite side. You can try to heat this up and whack it on something to try and knock the bearing out. That sometimes works. You could also drill a couple of small holes back here and knock them out, but that leaves it open to debris to get in. Or you can use the method I'm going to show you now, which is the one I prefer and is the most fun. For this, you're going to need a punch or a bolt or something that's just a little bit smaller than the inner diameter of the bearing. You're going to need a hammer, and most importantly, you're going to need a piece of bread. Seriously, though, you're going to need a piece of bread. So what you're going to do here is you're going to take that piece of bread, break off little pieces of it, and jam those down into the inner hole on the bearing. Push that in. Just do that a little bit at a time with the punch. And I know this seems silly, but stick with me. Once you get that jammed in there really well with the punch, you're then going to want to take your hammer and give that some taps. Push that in even further, and then add more bread. And what we're doing here is we're actually going to hydraulically push that bearing out with the bread. The bread's going to go in behind the bearing, and it will shove that bearing out. This is surprisingly effective. You'll end up extruding a little bit of the bread out around your punch unless it's perfectly sized. That's not a big deal. This will still work. You can see that bearing starting to move already. You could also do this trick with grease or basically anything thick enough to hydraulically push this out. And we are almost there, guys. And there we go. The bearing is removed. You can see all that bread got pushed in behind it. This may destroy the bearing, but if you're taking the bearing out, it's probably bad anyway. Let me get these end bells cleaned up, then we'll put the new bearings in. And that's good enough. These do not have to be perfectly clean. Mostly you just want to make sure that where you're putting the bearings doesn't have a bunch of junk in it. I just use some soap, water, and my girlfriend's toothbrush. How you install these depends on what they are. If it's just double shielded, it doesn't matter. If you've got double sealed, it doesn't matter. However, if you've got sealed on one side and shielded on the other, on the front end bell, you're going to want the sealed side to go out. And on the rear end bell, you probably want the sealed side to go in, just because that's the side that's going to be exposed to the most contaminants. In order to safely install these, I recommend getting a socket that is just the right size to contact the outer race without touching the rest of the bearing. You do not want to be pounding on anything but the race that's actually interfacing with what you're installing on. Since we're installing on the outer race here, we want to be interfacing with that outer race. If you do anything else, you risk damaging it. Now, you could just put this in, tap it in. However, it's going to be more difficult than if you put a little bit of heat on this end bell. I'm just going to stick this end bell on this other socket. You do not need to go crazy with this preheating. It's just to warm it up to expand the aluminum a little bit. You probably should do this outside. And then you can put your bearing in, and it might just fall right in. However, you might need to tap it in. I think I got that end bell a little bit warm. Let's be a little less aggressive on this one. That ought to do it. And those just fell in, but like I said, you might need to tap them in. Make sure they're seated all the way down in the pocket though. I also went ahead and blew out the inside of the motor housing. While you're in there, this is a perfect time to inspect everything. Just make sure that none of the windings look charred or burned. And we can go ahead and reinstall everything. Again, I did overheat this rear end bell, not a big deal, but make sure you don't heat them up too much when you go to install the bearings. Once we've got the rear end bell installed, we can go ahead and reinstall the rotor. We're going to put the spacer back on the rear, and then we're going to install this kind of sideways so that the spacer doesn't fall off. Be careful because these magnets are going to pull this in pretty hard. So make sure you've got a good grip on it and try not to let it slam in there too quickly. And There we go. For just a little bit of time and 16 bucks, we fixed the bearing in this and saved this motor. Before we go to saving these motors, why don't we throw this in a car, make sure it still works. I think the new Team Corelli Synchro would be perfect for this. Okay, intermission over. Let's take a look at this next motor. This one has a bad sensor on it. When I hook it up censored, it does not work properly. Let's go ahead and pull this end bell off and just take a look at that sensor board. Unfortunately, this is not working properly, and I just wanted to inspect it really quickly to see if there's any obvious problems with it. I don't see any problems with any of the solder points on here, and I don't see really any problems with the pins on the back, though there are a couple of dark ones on here. We can try cleaning this with some contact cleaner and see if that fixes it. This is just some generic contact cleaner. If you don't have contact cleaner, you could use alcohol as well. I'm just going to spray a tiny bit on the edge of this piece of paper towel, and then we'll take that and rub it across the pins, get it down in there, and see if we can't clean those out. You can see we got a little bit of dirt out of there. I don't suspect this is going to work, but let me go try it off camera. Unfortunately, that didn't work. Fortunately, it doesn't matter. The great thing about a censored motor is you can also run it sensorless, so we can just not plug that cable in and run this motor as a sensorless motor, and it'll be just fine. It would be really nice if Castle sold replacement sensor boards, as they're very easy to swap out, and they're pretty much universal across their models as far as I can tell, but whereas they do sell some parts for their motors, that's not one of them. Moving on to our next motor, this one's got two problems, a stuck-on pinion and wire damage. We'll deal with the pinion in a minute, but first, let's take a look at wire damage. Wire damage is pretty common with these motors, and it's usually fairly easy to fix. As you can see here, this bullet is actually ripped off or missing. Fortunately, I've got a used replacement right here, but sometimes we also run into situations where the wiring itself will get damaged, and how easy it is to fix depends on what type of wiring we have. Coming out of brushless motors, we typically have two different kinds of wiring. We've got this nice, flexible silicone wiring, or sometimes you'll see wiring that looks like this. It's a lot stiffer and it doesn't have that nice silicone jacket. This wiring is actually the windings from inside the motor itself that have been brought out here and terminated. These have been terminated internally, and then additional wire has been added here. This is a lot easier to work with than this because this has the same enamel on it that the windings in the motor actually have, and that enamel can be pretty tricky to work with. That being said, you can fix both. This is just more challenging. This is going to be pretty straightforward, though we are going to need a pretty stout soldering iron because this is big wire, and this is a heavy-duty connector. I've got a Heiko FX888D here, and it is just barely good enough for this job. Now, what we want to do is just add some fresh leaded solder to this end. That will make it a lot easier to put this back together. Now, if you want a full soldering tutorial, including the best equipment to use, make sure you get subscribed because we're going to be doing that pretty soon. Next, we just want to add some solder into the connector. If you don't have the connector, you can get these on Amazon. They're pretty inexpensive, and it's actually good to have some of them handy. Once we've got that filled up, we can reheat the wire and then stuff them together. This might take a couple of tries. It's a little tricky to get everything heated at once, especially if you don't have the best soldering equipment. But fortunately, the silicone insulation on this wire is pretty forgiving, and once everything gets hot enough, it should just fall in there. There we go. I think that's all the way in. We'll give that a minute to solidify. Chances are you are going to have some excess because that's just what always happens. You can get that right off there with your soldering iron. Once you're done with that, get some good adhesive-lined heat shrink tubing. This is a little large, but it should still work. And there we go, good as new. Now, if you had a problem with damaged wiring, you could always cut the wiring back or heat shrink over the damaged areas. Most wiring problems that are external to the motor can be fixed. If you have a problem with the internal windings, that's a different story. It probably means the motor is junk. Now let's move on to one of the most common mechanical failures, and that's a stuck pinion. There's a lot of different things we can do about this. The first one is don't let the pinion be stuck in the first place. If you are the one installing it, use blue thread locker or just a tiny bit of red thread locker. Don't go crazy with it. Don't thread lock the pinion to the shaft. It's not necessary. As long as you clean the threads on the pinion and the grub screw with alcohol or brake cleaner, put your thread locker on there, install, tighten, and give it 24 hours to cure. It should not come off. When it comes time to take it off, make sure you use a pick, clean out that grub screw. You want to use good quality tools. These are MIP bits. This is what I recommend. Make sure it fits in there well and it's all the way in, and then remove it. If you leave a bunch of dirt in there, use low quality tools, you're going to have a problem. If it doesn't easily come off, that thread locker can be softened up just by taking your soldering iron, holding it in that pinion grub screw hole. Make sure there's not a lot of solder on here so you don't end up putting a blob of solder in there. Warm that up. That will free the thread lock, and then you can take it off. If you've already stripped out the grub screw, you do have a few options. If you've got good access to it, you could drill the grub screw out. You could take a Dremel with a cutoff wheel and cut through the grub screw and the gear and then pull it off. You can actually take a couple of pry bars or screwdrivers and just pry the gear off. That might end up damaging the shaft or the motor though, so I don't recommend it unless you have no other choice. Or you can use what I think is the best solution, and that is a set of these easy outs. These come in a lot of different sizes, and you can get a kit like this on Amazon that goes way down to really small sizes fairly inexpensively. As you can see here, this size fits perfectly into this grub screw, and this will often work to get a stripped grub screw out. However, you might only get one shot at it, so you want to set yourself up for success. What I'd recommend doing first is making sure that this is very clean, no dirt inside that socket. Take your soldering iron or another way to heat this up, get this nice and warm, and take your extractor, start pushing it into the grub screw, and if you're lucky, it'll bite, and that grub screw will start to come out. I saw that one start to move. Once it starts to move, you can usually finish it off with the regular hex wrench, and then it'll come off. If that extractor doesn't work, you can try drilling out the grub screw. You need to be really careful though, because your drill can break, and if it breaks off inside there, your options are really limited. Beyond that, like I said, your only real option is to take a cutoff wheel on a Dremel and cut through that, cutting through the gear as well, and then you can pull it off of the motor. Occasionally, you might run into a situation where this grub screw is buried down behind a mount. If that's the case, you're probably going to be cutting through the mount as well, or just trying to pry the gear off. If you're going to pry the gear off, heat the gear up first. That will let the gear expand and make that a lot easier. I've had quite a few gears stuck on quite a few shafts, and between drilling, dremeling, and extracting, I've always been able to get them off, usually without damaging the shaft at all or very little. Now let's move on to what I think is going to be the most challenging one, a broken bolt in the motor mount. A lot of times you can just turn the motor mount and use a different set of bolt holes. In this case, unfortunately, this is the only set of bolt holes with this bolt pattern, so we need to try and get this out of here. First thing I'm going to do is take this end bell off. We're just going to do this to make it easier to work on and give us access to both sides. And you can see the broken bolt down there in the hole. We're going to be using the smallest extractor for this, and it does come with a little drill. I'm going to get a little center punch. Let's see if we can make this work. Unfortunately, in this case, this bolt is too hard to use the extractor's bit. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and drill this out, and hopefully we can just pick out the remaining pieces. This is going to be a little bit tedious, but it's kind of the only option you have now. I'm going to put a piece of tape over this so we don't get shavings in the bearing. And there we go, guys. After a few minutes of careful drilling, I was able to get that out of there, and I was able to salvage the threads for the most part. That being said, I'd recommend just using one of these other sets of holes if you can on a situation like this, because that isn't the easiest thing in the world to deal with. That's how to fix most of the common problems you're going to face with a motor in this hobby. Obviously, there are going to be some issues that you can't fix. Those are usually going to be related to the internal wiring on a motor or possibly catastrophic physical damage. But most problems you're going to face with motors like these can be fixed with a little bit of patience, a little bit of skill building, and maybe a couple extra tools. That being said, I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list. Let me know down in the comments what you do to fix your motors that I missed in this list. I'd love to hear from you. Make sure you get subscribed, then check out one of these.